don't think your damn military medals make you better than me. You sit there thinking you're untouchable because you're black and got a fancy uniform.
Everything legally required, sir. Every document's valid. Every command follows.
You're abusing authority because of who I am, not what I do.
The sheriff's hand moved to his weapon before the Navy SEAL could even finish his sentence. One moment, Lieutenant Commander James Rees was explaining why his temporary registration was perfectly legal. The next, he was staring down the barrel of department-issued authority backed by nothing but assumption and ego. What happened in the following 11 minutes would cost Brazos County more than their entire annual budget and end a 23-year law enforcement career in disgrace. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to someone like James. Not on a random Tuesday afternoon on State Highway 21. James had been driving back from visiting his mother in Houston. She'd just turned 70, and he'd spent the weekend helping her reorganize the garage, fix a leaking faucet, and listen to stories about his late father. Standard son duties. He was tired but content, looking forward to getting back to base in San Diego. His truck was new, purchased just 2 weeks earlier from a dealership in Virginia near his previous duty station. The temporary tags were clearly visible in the rear window, valid for another 45 days. Sheriff Clayton Briggs saw something else entirely. Briggs had been with the department since he was 21 years old, worked his way up from deputy to sheriff through what he called old-fashioned police work. Others might call it something different. His record showed a pattern of stops concentrated in specific neighborhoods, targeting specific demographics. 17 formal complaints over 2 decades, all dismissed or marked as unfounded. The system had protected him perfectly until the moment he decided to pull over the wrong person on the wrong day with a dash cam recording every second. The initial stop seemed routine enough. Briggs activated his lights and James pulled over immediately, hands visible on the steering wheel before the sheriff even approached. Textbook compliance. James had been through this before, more times than he cared to count. He knew the script by heart. But Briggs wasn't following any script. The sheriff approached the driver's side window with his hand already resting on his holster. Not hovering near it, actually resting on it, fingers drumming against the leather. James noticed immediately. His training kicked in, the same heightened awareness that had kept him alive during 3 combat deployments in hostile territories. This wasn't standard procedure. This was a man looking for confrontation. License and registration. The words came out flat, no courtesy, no explanation for the stop. James handed over his military ID along with his driver's license. He explained about the temporary registration, pointed to the clearly visible documentation in the rear window. He kept his voice calm, professional, exactly how the Navy had trained him to handle tense situations. Diffuse, don't escalate. Provide information, maintain respect, follow protocol. Briggs barely glanced at the military ID before handing it back. He focused entirely on the temporary registration paperwork, studying it like it was written in code. James watched the sheriff's expression shift from scrutiny to something else. Not confusion, determination. The look of someone who'd already decided how this would end and was now just finding justification. The temporary tag looked suspicious. Briggs' voice had changed, harder now, accusatory. James felt his stomach tighten. Suspicious how? The paperwork was legitimate, issued by a licensed Virginia dealership, completely legal under federal interstate commerce regulations. Thousands of people drove through Texas every day with similar documentation. That's when Briggs asked James to step out of the vehicle. No reasonable officer makes that request during a routine traffic stop for a documentation check. James knew it. Briggs knew it. But Briggs had a badge and a gun and 23 years of getting away with exactly this kind of behavior. James had military training, combat experience, and the knowledge that one wrong move could end with him bleeding out on Texas asphalt while his mother wondered why he never made it home. He stepped out of the truck. The dash cam captured everything in crystalline detail. James, standing with his hands clearly visible, speaking in measured tones, explaining his military service, his recent purchase of the vehicle, the complete legitimacy of his documentation. Briggs, circling like a predator, finding fault with everything. The way James was standing, the tone of his voice, The fact that he was asking questions about why this stop was necessary. "You're being uncooperative." Briggs said it loud enough for the dash cam to catch every syllable. The accusation was absurd on its face. James had complied with every single request, provided every document asked for, maintained perfect composure despite increasingly hostile treatment. But Briggs needed James to be uncooperative, needed him to be a threat, because what came next required justification. Briggs called for backup. Within 6 minutes, 2 additional patrol units arrived. Neither deputy had any idea what they were responding to. Dispatch had reported a suspicious vehicle stop with an uncooperative driver. They pulled up expecting potential danger, and instead found a Navy SEAL standing next to his truck with perfect military posture, speaking respectfully to their sheriff, surrounded by documentation proving he'd done nothing wrong. Deputy Angela Martinez arrived first. 15-year veteran, solid record, no complaints. She immediately sensed something wasn't right about this situation. The second deputy, rookie officer named Kyle Chen, was too new to question anything. He just took position where Briggs directed him. James watched 3 officers position themselves around him like he'd committed murder instead of driving while black in a new truck. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. He'd faced enemy combatants in Fallujah with less firepower pointed in his direction. Martinez asked Briggs what was going on. The sheriff's explanation made no sense even to her. Suspicious temporary registration, uncooperative driver, possible stolen vehicle. Each claim more ridiculous than the last, contradicted by the physical evidence sitting right there in James's hands. But here's what Martinez understood that Chen didn't yet. Challenging your sheriff on scene in front of a civilian wasn't how you kept your job in Brazos County. You might have questions, you might know something isn't right, but you swallow it, follow orders, and maybe bring it up later through proper channels. That's how the system works. That's how bad cops keep operating for decades. She took position and said nothing. Briggs demanded James submit to a vehicle search. James asked on what grounds, since he'd committed no crime, and the stop itself lacked reasonable suspicion. That question, that completely legal and reasonable question, was apparently the final straw. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Briggs's voice had gone cold. The dash cam captured James's expression in that moment. Not fear, not anger. Something worse. Resignation. The look of a man who'd served his country with distinction, earned medals for valor, saved lives under enemy fire, and was now being handcuffed on a Texas highway for asking a question. The metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Standard police handcuffs, same kind used on actual criminals. They were too tight. James didn't complain. He'd been through worse in SEER school. Martinez watched this happen and felt her stomach turn. She'd seen questionable stops before. She'd witnessed Briggs push boundaries. But this was different. This was a clear violation happening right in front of her, recorded for posterity, and she was part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. Chen, young and eager, genuinely believed they'd just arrested someone dangerous. That's what Briggs had told them. That's what the sheriff's 23 years of experience suggested. Why would he lie? James stood there, handcuffed, breathing steadily, maintaining his composure through sheer force of will. His mind was already working through what would happen next. The arrest report Briggs would file, the charges that would be fabricated, the system that would initially believe a sheriff over a black man, even one in uniform. But James had something most victims of wrongful arrest don't have: resources, knowledge, connections, and most importantly, irrefutable video evidence of every single second. What Sheriff Clayton Briggs didn't realize as he walked James toward his patrol car, what he wouldn't understand until lawyers started filing paperwork, was that he'd just made the most expensive mistake of his life. The patrol car's back seat was designed for criminals, hard plastic molded to be just uncomfortable enough, no handles on the inside of the doors, a metal grate separating front from back. James sat perfectly still, his hands cuffed behind him, watching the Texas landscape roll past through the window. Briggs was on the radio. James could hear fragments through the grate. Subject in custody, resisting lawful commands, possible stolen vehicle investigation ongoing. Each word another lie being broadcast into the official record. Each phrase another brick in a wall of false narrative that would need to be torn down piece by piece. They pulled into the county detention center 20 minutes later. The building squatted low and gray against the afternoon sun. Briggs parked in the secure bay where suspects were processed away from public view. He opened the back door and hauled James out by his arm. The grip was unnecessarily rough. Performative force for the cameras mounted above the entrance. Inside, the booking area smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. A deputy named Rodriguez sat behind bulletproof glass, processing paperwork from an earlier arrest. He looked up when Briggs walked in with James and his expression flickered. Just for a second. Surprise, maybe. Confusion. But he caught himself and went back to neutral. Briggs started rattling off charges. Resisting arrest. Failure to comply with lawful orders. Obstruction of an investigation. Rodriguez typed them into the system, his fingers moving across the keyboard in practiced rhythm. James said nothing. He'd already requested an attorney. Anything he said now would only be used against him. The booking process took 40 minutes. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property inventory. James's wallet containing his military ID, his driver's license, 3 credit cards, and $87 cash. His phone, his keys, his watch, a Tag Heuer his unit had chipped in to buy him when he made captain. Everything cataloged and sealed in a manila envelope. Rodriguez held up the military ID. Active duty? Briggs snatched it from his hand. Doesn't matter. Process him. But Rodriguez had already seen it. The ID was current. The rank was legitimate. This wasn't some kid fresh out of basic. This was a captain in the United States Army sitting in handcuffs because he'd asked questions during a traffic stop. Rodriguez didn't say anything else, but James saw him glance at the wall clock and make a note on a separate piece of paper. The timestamp. Something felt wrong to him, and he was creating his own record. James was moved to a holding cell. Concrete walls, metal bench, a toilet in the corner with no privacy. One other person occupied the space, a middle-aged man sleeping off whatever substance had landed him there. The cell door clanged shut with the particular finality that only steel on steel can produce. This was the part where most people panic, where the reality of arrest, of being caged, of having zero control crashes down. James had been trained for this. Not specifically for wrongful arrest by corrupt small-town sheriffs, but for captivity in general. He knew how to manage his mind in confined spaces. He sat on the metal bench, closed his eyes, and started running through everything that had happened in chronological order. Every word, every action, building the mental framework he'd need when lawyers started asking questions. 3 hours passed. The man on the opposite bench woke up, mumbled something incoherent, and passed out again. James remained still, patient. The door finally opened, and a different deputy appeared, taller, older, with gray at his temples. His nameplate read Foster. "You've got a phone call." James stood and followed him down a corridor to a room with a single phone mounted on the wall. Foster removed the handcuffs. "Call's private. Take your time." The door closed. James picked up the receiver and dialed his attorney, a man named Vincent Shore, who handled legal affairs for several officers at Fort Hood. The phone rang twice before Shore answered. "James? I got a very interesting call from Brazos County about 30 minutes ago. Tell me what happened." James laid it out, factual, chronological, no emotion, just the sequence of events from the moment he saw the lights in his mirror to sitting in this room. Shore listened without interrupting. James could hear him typing notes on the other end. When James finished, there was a pause. Then Shore spoke, and his voice had changed, had an edge to it now. "James, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't just a bad stop. This is a civil rights violation. This is deprivation of rights under color of law. This is going to be federal." I know. Do you? Because I don't think you understand how big this is about to get. This sheriff just arrested an active-duty military officer, on camera, with zero probable cause, and then filed false charges. Do you know what the DOJ does to cases like this? James didn't answer. He was starting to understand. Shore continued. I'm filing emergency motions tonight. You'll be out in a few hours. But James, this doesn't end with you walking out of that cell. This goes much further. I need you to document everything while it's fresh. Every detail. Every word he said. I'm also calling Fort Hood's legal office. Your command needs to know one of their officers is sitting in county lockup on bogus charges. The call ended. James hung up and Foster reappeared to escort him back to the cell. But something had shifted in Foster's demeanor. The way he walked. The way he held himself. Less like a corrections officer and more like someone trying to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. You need anything? Water? I'm fine. Foster nodded and locked the cell door again, but his expression suggested he knew exactly how not fine this situation actually was. James sat back down on the metal bench. The other occupant was awake now, staring at the ceiling. He glanced over at James. What'd they get you for? James considered not answering, but something about the mundane normalcy of the question made him respond. Traffic stop. The man laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete. Yeah, they're good at that around here. Real good at finding reasons. Outside the cell, beyond the walls and the locked doors, Shore was already in motion. He'd pulled the dashcam footage through an emergency discovery request, claiming exigent circumstances and potential evidence tampering. It took one phone call to a judge he'd worked with before. The judge, a former Marine, expedited everything. Shore watched the footage in his office, all 43 minutes of it. His paralegal stood behind him, watching over his shoulder. Neither spoke until it ended. The paralegal broke the silence first. He's finished, the sheriff. He's completely finished. Shore nodded slowly. He wasn't just finished. This was career-ending, pension-threatening, potentially criminal charges against him territory. The footage showed everything. The lack of probable cause, the escalation, the false statements, the wrongful arrest. All of it captured in high definition with timestamps. But Shore also knew something else. Cases like this, even with perfect evidence, could take years. The system protected its own. Police unions, qualified immunity, the blue wall of silence. Briggs had 23 years on the job. He'd have support. He'd have lawyers. He'd fight this with every resource available. So Shore made another call. This one to a contact at the ACLU, then another to a civil rights attorney in Dallas who specialized in police misconduct, then a third to a journalist who'd covered similar cases. By midnight, 5 different organizations knew James's name and had copies of the footage. Back in the cell, James had no idea this machinery was already turning. He just sat there, breathing steadily, maintaining his composure. The man across from him had fallen asleep again. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was yelling at a deputy about their medication. James closed his eyes and thought about his daughter. She was 7. Too young to understand why Daddy wasn't home tonight. His wife would shield her from this, come up with some explanation about work. But eventually, she'd be old enough to ask questions. Old enough to understand that her father, who served his country, who wore the uniform, who did everything right, still ended up in handcuffs on a Texas highway. That thought, more than anything else that had happened today, made James angry. Not the scared, reactive anger that gets people hurt. The cold, focused anger that sustains you through long campaigns. The kind that doesn't burn out. He opened his eyes and stared at the concrete wall. Briggs had made a mistake today. A catastrophic, career-ending, possibly life-altering mistake. And James was going to make absolutely certain everyone understood exactly what that mistake cost. Morning came with the sound of metal doors and shuffling footsteps. James hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Briggs's face. That smirk. That absolute certainty that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. A deputy James hadn't seen before unlocked the cell. Breakfast trays were distributed on plastic traps. Powdered eggs, gray meat that might have been sausage, toast that bent like rubber. James ate mechanically, forcing down the calories. He'd learned in the military that you eat when food is available. You never know when the next meal is coming. 2 hours later, another deputy arrived. This one was older, probably close to retirement. His name tag read Sullivan. He told James he was being transferred to county for arraignment. The process was slow and deliberate. More paperwork, more waiting. James was handcuffed again, the metal biting into his wrists in exactly the same spots as yesterday. The bruises were already forming, dark purple rings around both wrists. Sullivan noticed but said nothing. The transport van was cramped and hot. 3 other people were already inside, separated by metal mesh. Nobody spoke. The drive took 40 minutes through flat Texas countryside. Strip malls gave way to fields, then back to developed areas as they approached the county seat. The courthouse was a massive concrete structure that looked like it had been built in the 70s and never updated. Beige walls, narrow windows, American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. James was processed again. Different facility, same routine. Fingerprints even though they already had them. Photograph even though they already took one. More questions even though he'd answered them all yesterday. The system grinding forward with bureaucratic indifference. He was placed in a holding cell with about 15 other people, all waiting for their turn before the judge. Some looked terrified. Others looked bored, like they'd been through this enough times that it no longer registered as remarkable. Shore arrived at the courthouse an hour before James's scheduled arraignment. He'd brought 2 associates and enough documentation to fill a briefcase. The dashcam footage was loaded on a tablet, ready to play. He'd also brought something else. A letter from James's commanding officer, written overnight and expedited through military channels. It detailed James's service record, his deployments, his commendations, his character. Shore knew it wouldn't matter for the legal arguments, but it would matter for optics. And in cases like this, optics mattered almost as much as the law. The arraignment was scheduled for 10:30. By 10:15, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread somehow, maybe through Shore's calls last night, maybe through social media, maybe just through the network of people who paid attention to these things. The gallery was filled with observers, some taking notes, others just watching. James recognized the type: activists, journalists, people who showed up when the system needed witnesses. Judge Catherine Reeves took the bench at exactly 10:30. She was in her late 50s, appointed rather than elected, with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She looked at the docket, then looked at the prosecutor, then looked at Shore. Her expression suggested she already knew this wasn't going to be a standard proceeding. The prosecutor stood first. His name was Glenn Porter, an assistant district attorney who'd been handling arraignments for 6 years. He began outlining the charges against James: evading arrest, resisting an officer, failure to comply with lawful orders. His voice was steady, professional, reading from prepared notes like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Shore stood when it was his turn. He didn't use notes. He spoke directly to Judge Reeves, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He outlined the timeline of yesterday's stop, the lack of probable cause, the escalating demands, the threats. He mentioned the dashcam footage and offered to play it right there in open court. Judge Reeves held up a hand. She said she'd review the footage in chambers before making any determinations. She asked Porter if the state had seen the footage. Porter hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the courtroom everything they needed to know. He hadn't seen it. The sheriff's department hadn't provided it to the prosecutor's office. They'd arrested James, filed charges, and moved forward without bothering to review their own evidence. Judge Reeves's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around her eyes. She called a recess and requested both attorneys in her chambers immediately. James was led back to the holding cell. He sat on the concrete bench and waited. Around him, other defendants whispered to each other, speculating about what was happening. One man, probably in his early 20s, asked James what he'd done. James didn't answer. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. James counted the tiles on the floor. 87 visible from where he sat. He counted them 3 times to make sure. When the deputies finally came to retrieve him, their demeanor had changed. Not friendly, but different. More careful. They brought him back to the courtroom where Judge Reeves was already seated. Shore was at the defense table, his expression neutral, but his posture relaxed. Porter stood at the prosecution table, looking like someone had just told him his house was on fire. Judge Reeves spoke directly to James. She informed him that all charges were being dismissed without prejudice. She said the court had reviewed the evidence and determined there was insufficient basis to proceed. She also said something else. She was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential civil rights violations. The words hung in the air like smoke. James felt Shore's hand on his shoulder, a brief squeeze of reassurance. The judge continued. She stated for the record that the court found serious concerns about the conduct of the arresting officer. She noted that the dashcam footage raised questions about training, supervision, and departmental policies. She said these concerns extended beyond this single incident and warranted comprehensive investigation. Every word was being transcribed by the court reporter. Every word would become part of the permanent record. Every word was another nail in Briggs' professional coffin. Porter tried to salvage something. He stood and requested the dismissal be with prejudice, meaning the charges could never be refiled. Judge Reeves denied the request. She said the state needed to determine whether the evidence supported different charges against different defendants. The implication was clear. Maybe James shouldn't be charged. Maybe someone else should be. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Reeves gavelled for order, then dismissed the proceeding. James walked out of the courthouse 20 minutes later, a free man for the first time in 18 hours. The sunlight felt aggressive after the fluorescent gloom of cells and courtrooms. Shore stood beside him on the courthouse steps, fielding questions from reporters who'd gathered outside. James said nothing. He just stood there, blinking in the bright Texas sun, trying to process that this part was over. But he knew it wasn't really over. This was just the beginning. Shore drove James back to the impound lot where his truck had been towed. The fees were astronomical. $217 for the tow, $90 per day for storage, administrative fees, processing fees, fees for fees. James paid with a credit card, each swipe feeling like another small injustice. His truck started on the first try. He sat in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. Shore tapped on the window. James rolled it down. We're filing the lawsuit tomorrow. Federal court. Civil rights violations, unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, emotional distress. We're also filing a formal complaint with the State Police Oversight Board and requesting a Department of Justice investigation into the department's practices. Shore's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. This is going to get ugly. They're going to fight. They're going to try to destroy your credibility. They're going to dig into every aspect of your life looking for ammunition. You need to be ready for that. James nodded slowly. He understood. He'd seen how institutions protected themselves, how they circled the wagons and attacked anyone who threatened their authority, how they turned victims into villains through carefully crafted narratives and selective evidence. But he also knew something Briggs and the sheriff's department didn't. He'd been trained to withstand pressure. He'd operated in environments where mistakes meant death. He'd maintained composure under circumstances that would break most people. A smear campaign from a rural Texas sheriff's department wasn't going to rattle him. Shore seemed to read his thoughts. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between people who understood what real combat looked like. Then he walked back to his own car. James drove home slowly, obeying every traffic law with meticulous precision. Every stop sign was a complete stop. Every turn signal activated exactly when required. Every speed limit followed to the letter. He felt eyes on him the whole way. Probably paranoia. Probably just residual hypervigilance from yesterday. But maybe not. Maybe every cop in the county now knew his face, his truck, his license plate. Maybe he was marked. The thought didn't scare him. It made him angry again. That cold, focused anger that didn't fade. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday morning in federal court. Shore didn't hold a press conference, but he didn't need to. The complaint was public record, and by noon, 3 news outlets had published stories with headlines that made the sheriff's department sound exactly as corrupt as they were. The document was 93 pages of methodical legal destruction. It named Officer Briggs, Sheriff Coleman, the department itself, and the county as defendants. It detailed every moment of the traffic stop, the illegal search, the fabricated arrest, the coordinated false testimony. It included timestamps from the dashcam footage that hadn't been released publicly yet. It quoted the audio of Briggs discussing how to justify the arrest after the fact. It presented evidence of a pattern. Turns out James wasn't the first person Briggs had targeted. Shore's investigators had found 7 other cases in the past 4 years where Briggs made arrests that were later dismissed or reduced to nothing. All 7 involved Black or Hispanic drivers. All 7 involved searches that found nothing illegal. All 7 resulted in people spending hours or days in custody before being released without charges or with charges that vanished mysteriously. The lawsuit demanded compensatory damages, punitive damages, legal fees, and a federal consent decree forcing the department to reform its practices under court supervision. The number attached to the demand was substantial: $3.7 million. The county's insurance carrier received the complaint and immediately contacted their lawyers. By Friday afternoon, those lawyers were in emergency meetings trying to assess their exposure. Their conclusion was grim. The dashcam footage alone made this case almost impossible to defend. The audio of Briggs and the other officer discussing how to justify the arrest was catastrophic. The pattern evidence suggested institutional problems that went beyond one bad cop. If this went to trial, a jury would eviscerate them. Monday morning, the sheriff's department held a press conference. Sheriff Coleman stood at a podium looking like a man who'd aged 10 years over the weekend. He announced that Officer Briggs had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. He said the department took allegations of misconduct seriously and was committed to transparency and accountability. He said he couldn't comment on pending litigation, but assured the public that his department operated with integrity. The reporters didn't buy it. They asked pointed questions about the pattern of dismissed cases. They asked why Briggs was still employed if the evidence was so damning. They asked if the sheriff planned to resign. Coleman deflected, repeated his prepared statements, and left without answering most of the questions. The internal investigation was a joke. Everyone involved knew it. Internal investigations almost always were. The investigator assigned was a sergeant who'd worked alongside Briggs for 6 years. The interviews were cursory. The conclusions were predetermined. 3 weeks later, the department announced that while Officer Briggs had made errors in judgment, there was insufficient evidence of intentional wrongdoing. He would receive additional training and return to duty with restrictions on conducting traffic stops without backup. Shore received the report and laughed out loud when he read it. He filed a supplemental complaint in federal court, arguing that the sham investigation proved the department's institutional corruption. He requested the judge expedite discovery so they could depose Briggs, Coleman, and every officer involved before the department could coordinate their stories further. The judge, a Carter appointee with a reputation for not tolerating law enforcement misconduct, granted the request. Depositions were scheduled for 6 weeks out. During those 6 weeks, James tried to resume normal life. He went back to work at the construction company, but the arrest had changed things. His supervisor was supportive, but some coworkers treated him differently, like he was fragile or dangerous, or both. One guy actually asked if James was going to sue them too. The paranoia about being targeted by police never fully disappeared. Every time James drove anywhere, he watched his mirrors obsessively. Every patrol car he saw sent his heart rate spiking. He started taking different routes to avoid certain roads. He installed a second dash cam facing backward. The psychological toll was heavier than he'd expected. He found himself having trouble sleeping. When he did sleep, he dreamed about being handcuffed, about metal bars, about officers laughing while planting evidence. He started researching therapists who specialized in trauma but didn't actually call any of them. Admitting he needed help felt like giving Briggs another victory. Then, the deposition started. Shore brought in an associate to help with the questioning. They spent 12 hours over 3 days deposing Briggs, and the officer fell apart spectacularly. Under oath, confronted with his own recorded words, and caught in multiple contradictions, Briggs couldn't maintain his story. He claimed he couldn't remember specific details. He blamed his training. He suggested James must have seemed suspicious for reasons he couldn't articulate. He denied racial bias while simultaneously describing his approach to traffic stops in ways that revealed obvious bias. Shore was relentless. He walked Briggs through every second of the encounter, forcing him to explain each decision. Why this car? Why this justification? Why search without consent? Why arrest for a non-existent warrant? The officer's answers became increasingly incoherent. At one point, Briggs actually said he felt threatened by James's military bearing. A decorated veteran sitting calmly in his truck was threatening because he sat up straight. The absurdity was documented in the deposition transcript for posterity. Sheriff Coleman's deposition was worse for the defense. He admitted under questioning that he'd received complaints about Briggs before. He acknowledged that the pattern of dismissed cases should have triggered review. He confirmed that departmental policy required supervisory approval for searches without consent, which Briggs had never obtained. He tried to defend his decision to support Briggs initially, but his explanation sounded hollow even to him. Shore asked one question that Coleman couldn't answer satisfactorily. If you believed Officer Briggs acted appropriately, why did you personally call the prosecutor to suggest dropping charges? Coleman stammered something about wanting to avoid unnecessary legal expenses. Shore let the answer hang there, speaking volumes through silence. The prosecutor who dropped the charges was deposed next. She was professional and careful, but her testimony was devastating for the defense. She confirmed that after reviewing the dashcam footage, she'd determined there was no probable cause for the arrest. She stated that she'd found the officer's justifications inconsistent with the evidence. She acknowledged that she'd recommended the county settle any potential civil suit quickly because their position was indefensible. 2 weeks after the depositions concluded, the county's lawyers requested a settlement conference. Shore agreed immediately. He knew what this meant. They were ready to pay. The settlement conference took place in a windowless room at the federal courthouse. James sat beside Shore at one table. Across from them sat 3 lawyers representing the county, the department, and the insurance carrier. A magistrate judge facilitated. The county opened with an offer of $200,000 in exchange for releasing all claims and signing a non-disclosure agreement. Shore rejected it without consulting James. The number was insulting, and the NDA was a non-starter. They went back and forth for 6 hours. The county gradually increased their offer. $300,000, $450,000, $600,000. Each time, Shore countered higher, and each time, he refused any agreement that included a confidentiality clause. James needed to be able to tell his story. The public needed to know what happened. Sunlight was the only disinfectant that mattered. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. The magistrate called a break and spoke privately with each side. When they reconvened, the county put their final offer on the table. $1.2 million. No NDA. Briggs would be terminated. The department would implement mandatory bias training and reform its search and arrest policies under independent oversight. James would receive a written apology from Sheriff Coleman. Shore looked at James. The decision was his. James thought about the 18 hours in custody, the humiliation, the fear, the anger that still hadn't fully dissipated. He thought about the 7 other people Briggs had done this to. He thought about how many more there might be that they hadn't found. $1.2 million wouldn't undo what happened. Money never could. But it would send a message. It would make other departments think twice. It would cost the people who'd violated his rights something real. James nodded once. Shore accepted the offer. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. James received a check that changed his financial situation permanently. He paid off his truck, his mother's house, every debt he'd accumulated. He put the rest in investments Shore's office recommended. Briggs was fired 2 days after the settlement was signed. No ceremony, no announcement, just a termination letter and an escort out of the building. He tried to appeal through his union, but even they couldn't defend what the depositions had revealed. Sheriff Coleman announced his retirement 4 months later, citing health reasons. Everyone knew the real reason. The Department of Justice opened a pattern and practice investigation into the Sheriff's Department based on the evidence from James's case. That investigation was still ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested systemic problems that would require years of federal oversight to correct. James never went back to construction. He used part of the settlement money to enroll in college, studying criminal justice. His plan was to understand the system from the inside, then work to change it. Maybe become a lawyer himself eventually. Maybe just an advocate. He hadn't decided yet. What he had decided was that what happened to him couldn't just be about money and revenge. It had to mean something larger. It had to prevent the next person from experiencing what he'd experienced. The anger had transformed into purpose. On a warm evening 6 months after the settlement, James drove past the spot where Briggs had pulled him over. He didn't slow down or stop. He just drove past, noting it without emotion, and continued toward wherever he was headed next. That stretch of highway looks the same as it did the day Briggs pulled him over. The asphalt still bakes under the Texas sun. Cars still roll past at 70 miles per hour, drivers never knowing what happened on this particular patch of road. Nothing marks the spot. No memorial, no sign. Just another piece of American highway where someone's life got turned inside out because a man with a badge decided that authority trumped humanity. James thinks about that sometimes when he's sitting in his criminal justice classes. Thinks about how many other spots like that exist across the country. How many other people got handcuffed for nothing? How many didn't have dash cams or lawyers or the resources to fight back? The system worked for him, eventually, but only because he could force it to work. That realization sits heavy. Briggs is working security at a shopping mall now, last anyone heard. Coleman plays golf and collects his pension. The department operates under federal oversight, which means more paperwork and training sessions that officers sit through while checking their phones. Change happens slowly when it happens at all. But that $1.2 million sent a message that reverberated beyond Brazos County. It showed up in training materials. It got cited in other civil rights cases. It became the example of what happens when the system actually holds people accountable for abusing their power. Not justice exactly. More like a warning that sometimes, occasionally, the cost of racism and corruption becomes too high to ignore. James still checks his mirrors obsessively when he drives. Still feels his pulse spike when he sees patrol cars. The settlement paid for therapy, which helps, but some things don't heal completely. They just become part of who you are. Scars you carry forward. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there. Can't shut your mind off. And the next day, you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.
You think your fancy little Navy badge makes you untouchable? You think you're better than everyone else?
I've done nothing wrong. I've been sober. I want a supervisor. I'm complying under protest.
You think you can talk back, huh?
Don't think I haven't seen it before.
The traffic stop lasted exactly 8 minutes. By the time it was over, a decorated Navy SEAL's career hung in the balance. A police officer's body camera had recorded what would become the department's worst nightmare. And a routine DUI checkpoint had exploded into a federal investigation that would reach the highest levels of military command. Lieutenant Commander James Rivers wasn't drunk. He hadn't touched alcohol in 6 years. Not since completing SEAL training, where every decision could mean life or death for his team. But none of that mattered to Officer Dylan Grant, who had already decided what kind of person he was dealing with the moment he saw the driver's face. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in coastal Virginia. Rivers was driving home from the naval base after a 16-hour day of training exercises. His muscles ached, his mind was exhausted. All he wanted was to collapse into bed and sleep before the next brutal day began. The checkpoint appeared suddenly around a bend, orange cones funneling traffic into a single lane. Rivers slowed his truck and rolled down his window, expecting a quick license check and a wave-through. Grant approached the driver's side with a flashlight, shining it directly into Rivers' eyes. No greeting, no explanation of the checkpoint, just the blinding light and a command to produce his license and registration. Rivers reached slowly for his wallet, announcing each movement clearly because he knew how these situations could spiral. Military ID, driver's license, registration from the glove box. He handed them over. Grant studied the military ID for a long moment. Navy SEAL, officer rank, special operations clearance. Everything about the credentials screamed elite warrior, someone who had earned the right to wear one of the most respected insignias in the American military. Grant's expression didn't change. He asked Rivers to step out of the vehicle. Rivers asked why. Simple question. Reasonable question. The kind of question any citizen has the right to ask when being ordered from their vehicle without apparent cause. Grant's response was immediate and aggressive. He said Rivers was being uncooperative, that the smell of alcohol was coming from the vehicle, and that refusing to comply would result in arrest for obstruction. There was no smell of alcohol. Rivers hadn't had a drink in years. His truck contained nothing but training gear, water bottles, and protein bars. But Grant had made his determination, and facts weren't going to change it. Rivers stepped out of the truck, keeping his hands visible, moving with the careful precision of someone who had been trained to survive hostile situations. He stood 6'2", muscular from years of grueling physical training, his posture military straight despite the exhaustion. Grant told him to turn around and place his hands on the vehicle. Rivers complied, asking again what the probable cause was for this level of scrutiny. That's when Grant called for backup, claiming he had a belligerent suspect refusing to cooperate at a DUI checkpoint. The radio crackled to life. Another unit was dispatched. Rivers stood against his truck, hands on the hood, wondering how a simple checkpoint had transformed into whatever this was becoming. Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived 4 minutes later. She had been with the department for 12 years and had worked hundreds of DUI checkpoints. She approached the scene and immediately sensed something was off. The suspect wasn't swaying, wasn't slurring, wasn't showing any signs of impairment. He was standing perfectly still, completely calm, answering questions with clear, measured responses. Mitchell asked Grant what signs of intoxication he had observed. Grant said the driver had been nervous, evasive, and the vehicle smelled like alcohol. Mitchell walked around the truck looking through the windows with her own flashlight. She saw military gear, she saw water bottles, she didn't smell alcohol. She turned back to Grant with a questioning look. Grant ignored it. He told Rivers to perform a field sobriety test, and the tone in his voice made it clear this wasn't optional. Rivers asked if he was being detained or if he was free to go. Grant said he was being detained pending investigation of suspected DUI. Rivers asked to speak to a supervisor. Grant said a supervisor would be called after the field sobriety test was completed. Here's where the situation took a turn that would later be dissected by lawyers, internal affairs investigators, and military legal counsel. Rivers, knowing his rights and knowing he was completely sober, made a decision. He told Grant he would not submit to field sobriety tests without a supervisor present and without clear articulation of what probable cause existed for this detention beyond him being stopped at a checkpoint. Grant's face changed. The professional mask slipped. What emerged underneath was something uglier, something that the body camera would capture in perfect, high-definition clarity. He stepped closer to Rivers, invading his space, and said that people like him always thought they were above the law, always thought their little military credentials meant they could disrespect officers and get away with it. People like him. Those 3 words would become the focal point of everything that followed. Mitchell immediately intervened, stepping between them, asking Grant to take a moment and step back. Grant shrugged her off, his attention locked on Rivers. He told Rivers he was under arrest for obstruction of justice and refusal to comply with lawful orders. Before Rivers could respond, Grant had grabbed his arm and was reaching for his handcuffs. Rivers didn't resist. He didn't pull away. He didn't make any sudden movements. He simply stated, clearly for the body camera, that he was not resisting, that he was complying under protest, and that he wanted a supervisor immediately. His voice never rose. His tone never became aggressive. He stood there and let Grant cuff his hands behind his back while reciting his rights in a monotone voice that suggested he had done this many times before and couldn't care less about the individual circumstances. Mitchell was on her radio calling for a supervisor before the cuffs even clicked shut. Her voice had an urgency to it that suggested she understood this situation was already out of control and about to get much worse. Sergeant Paul Vincent arrived 9 minutes later. He was a 26-year veteran, 2 years from retirement, and he had seen enough bad stops in his career to recognize one immediately. He pulled up to see a man in handcuffs standing beside a pickup truck, another officer looking deeply uncomfortable, and Grant writing notes on a citation pad like nothing unusual had happened. Vincent asked what was going on. Grant explained that he had stopped a vehicle at the checkpoint, detected signs of intoxication, requested field sobriety tests, and arrested the driver for obstruction when he refused to comply. Standard procedure, according to Grant. Textbook stop. Vincent walked over to Rivers and asked his name. Rivers identified himself, rank included, and calmly explained that he had not been drinking, had asked for probable cause multiple times, and had requested a supervisor before any tests were administered. He said he believed he was being unlawfully detained and asked that someone review the body camera footage immediately. Vincent looked at the military ID still sitting on the hood of the truck. Navy SEAL. Officer. Special Operations. He looked at Rivers, standing there in perfect composure, despite being handcuffed on the side of the road. He looked at Grant, who was still writing his citation. He looked at Mitchell, whose expression told him everything he needed to know. Vincent made a decision that probably saved the department from an even bigger disaster than what was coming. He told Grant to remove the handcuffs immediately. Grant started to argue, but Vincent cut him off with a tone that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. The cuffs came off. Vincent then did something smart. He asked Rivers if he would be willing to take a breathalyzer test voluntarily, not as part of any legal requirement, but simply to establish the facts of the situation. Rivers agreed immediately. The portable breathalyzer was retrieved from Vincent's vehicle. Rivers blew into it. The reading came back 0.00. Completely sober. Not a trace of alcohol in his system. The silence that followed was deafening. Grant stared at the breathalyzer reading like it had personally insulted him. 0.00. The numbers glowed on the small screen, impossible to argue with, impossible to explain away. Vincent looked at the device, then at Grant, then back at Rivers. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He had seen officers make mistakes before, seen them dig themselves into holes, but this was different. This was a hole that went straight through to the other side of someone's career. Rivers broke the silence first. His voice was measured, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from years of training in situations far more stressful than this. He asked Vincent if he was free to go. Vincent said yes. He apologized, said the words several times actually, and explained that Rivers was absolutely free to leave. He mentioned that there would be a full review of the stop, that the body camera footage would be examined, and that Rivers would be contacted by Internal Affairs within 48 hours. Rivers nodded. He collected his military ID from the hood of his truck, his driver's license from wherever Grant had set it, and his registration papers that had somehow ended up on the ground. He didn't say another word to Grant, didn't even look at him. He simply got in his truck, started the engine, and drove away from the checkpoint at exactly the speed limit. Mitchell watched him go, then turned to Vincent with an expression that clearly said she had tried to stop this disaster before it happened. Vincent told her to write up everything she witnessed, every detail, every word spoken, every action taken. He wanted her report on his desk before the end of shift. Then he turned to Grant. The conversation that followed wasn't recorded because Vincent had the good sense to turn off his body camera, but other officers at the checkpoint watched from a distance as Vincent spoke in low, intense tones for almost 5 minutes straight. Grant's face went from defensive to pale to something approaching panic. When Vincent finished, he got in his patrol car and drove directly back to the station. Grant stood there for another 30 seconds before getting into his own vehicle and following. What Grant didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he had made every wrong assumption from the moment he saw Rivers, was that Rivers wasn't just any military officer. He wasn't even just any SEAL. Rivers was part of an elite unit that advised senior military leadership on special operations. He had security clearance that made most federal agents look like mall cops. He had testified before congressional committees. He had been in rooms where decisions about national security were made. And he had just been handcuffed on the side of a road for refusing to perform field sobriety tests while completely sober. Rivers drove home, parked in his driveway, and sat in his truck for 10 minutes. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't crying. He was thinking, processing, running through the encounter step by step, analyzing what had happened and why. He had faced armed insurgents in 3 different countries. He had made split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. He had been shot at, blown up, and left for dead on 2 separate occasions. And somehow, a traffic stop in his own country had left him feeling more violated than any of those experiences. The powerlessness was what got to him. In combat, you could fight back. You could strategize, adapt, overcome. But standing on that roadside, he had no options. Fighting back meant escalation, probably violence, possibly death. The statistics ran through his head unbidden. He knew what happened to people who resisted, especially people who looked like him. So he had stood there and let it happen. Let himself be humiliated and handcuffed, because the alternative was worse. He went inside, poured himself water, and called his commanding officer. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. His commander listened without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions about timing and witnesses, then said he would handle it. Rivers knew what that meant. By morning, phone calls would be made. Not angry calls, not threatening calls, just very official calls from very senior military personnel to very surprised civilian authorities. The kind of calls that make mayors and police chiefs start their day with heartburn. The internal affairs investigation started exactly 48 hours later, just as Vincent had promised. 2 investigators showed up at Rivers' home, apologized for the inconvenience, and asked if he would be willing to provide a statement. Rivers was willing. He sat at his kitchen table and walked them through the entire encounter in precise detail. Times, locations, exact quotes wherever possible, observations about each officer's demeanor and actions. The investigators recorded everything, took notes, asked clarifying questions. They were professional, respectful, clearly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. When Rivers finished, one of them asked if he had suffered any physical injuries during the arrest. Rivers said no. The investigator then asked if he had suffered any emotional or psychological distress. Rivers paused before answering that one. He could have said no, could have brushed it off, could have acted like it didn't matter. Instead, he told the truth. He said yes. He explained that being treated like a criminal in his own community, being judged and detained based on assumptions rather than evidence, had shaken his trust in the system he had spent 15 years defending. The investigator wrote that down word for word. The body camera footage was reviewed by 6 different people over the next week. Vincent watched it twice. The internal affairs investigators watched it 3 times together, then separately. The police chief watched it once and immediately called the city attorney. The city attorney watched it with a sick feeling in his stomach, knowing exactly what he was looking at. A textbook case of unlawful detention, false arrest, and civil rights violations, all captured in high-definition video with clear audio. Every lawyer's nightmare. Every plaintiff attorney's dream. Mitchell's written report corroborated everything on the video. She documented that she had questioned Grant's probable cause multiple times. She noted that Rivers had been cooperative and polite throughout. She stated clearly that she saw no evidence of intoxication and had disagreed with the decision to arrest. She included the detail about the breathalyzer reading of 0.00. She even added her opinion, which wasn't required, but which she included anyway, that the stop had been conducted improperly from the beginning and that Grant had allowed his personal assumptions to override his professional judgment. It was the kind of report that ends partnerships and creates permanent divisions within departments. Grant was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. He was told to surrender his badge and weapon, not to contact any other officers about the case, and to make himself the union representative assigned to his case took one look at the body camera footage and advised him to start looking for a good attorney. Not because the union wouldn't defend him, they would, but because the case was indefensible. The video showed everything. Every illegal decision, every ignored warning from Mitchell, every moment of Rivers standing there asking reasonable questions and getting arrested for it. 3 weeks after the stop, Rivers received a phone call from the police chief. Not from a secretary, not from an intermediary, but from the chief himself. The conversation was brief and carefully worded. The chief apologized for what had happened. He explained that the officer involved had been terminated and would not be working in law enforcement in that jurisdiction again. He said the department was reviewing its training procedures and checkpoint protocols to prevent similar incidents. He asked if there was anything else the department could do to make this right. Rivers appreciated the call, but both men knew it wasn't enough. Apologies don't erase the memory of standing handcuffed on a roadside while passing cars slow down to watch. Rivers hired an attorney anyway, not because he needed the money, his military salary was solid, but because he wanted accountability beyond just one officer losing his job. He wanted policy changes, documented and enforceable. He wanted training reforms that would actually stick. He wanted the next person in his situation to be treated differently. His attorney filed a federal civil rights lawsuit 4 weeks after the incident. The complaint was 37 pages long and included frame-by-frame analysis of the body camera footage. It named Grant, the police department, and the city. It alleged unlawful detention, false arrest, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages requested were substantial, not because Rivers needed the money, but because money was the only language municipalities understood when it came to forcing real change. The city attorney read the complaint and knew immediately that fighting it would be suicide. Everything in the filing was true and provable. The video evidence was damning. Mitchell's testimony would be devastating. Even Grant's own body camera showed him ignoring obvious signs that Rivers was sober and cooperative. Taking this to trial meant putting that video in front of a jury, and no jury was going to side with the officer who arrested a decorated military veteran for nothing. Settlement negotiations started within 60 days. The city's initial offer was insulting: $50,000 and a promise to review training materials. Rivers' attorney rejected it within an hour. They weren't negotiating with someone desperate for a quick payout. They were dealing with a man who had faced actual danger overseas and wasn't intimidated by bureaucratic posturing. The counteroffer came back at $750,000, plus mandatory policy reforms. Specifically, a complete overhaul of checkpoint procedures, quarterly civil rights training for all officers, and an independent review board for complaints involving unlawful stops. The city balked. $750,000 was a significant hit to their budget, and the policy demands meant admitting systemic problems rather than dismissing this as one bad officer. Their attorney tried to negotiate down, suggesting $250,000 with minimal policy changes. Rivers' attorney responded by filing a motion to depose the police chief, the training coordinator, and every officer who had worked checkpoints in the past 3 years. Suddenly, the city became very interested in settling quickly. Discovery would expose patterns. It would reveal how many other stops were questionable. It would show whether Grant had a history of similar behavior that supervisors had ignored. The city couldn't afford that kind of scrutiny. Not with election season approaching. Not with community tensions already high. Not with activists ready to turn this into a rallying point. 8 weeks after initial negotiations began, both sides reached an agreement. The final settlement was $600,000, paid directly to Rivers with no admission of wrongdoing from the city. That standard legal language meant nothing. Everyone knew what it really meant. The policy reforms were more significant than the money. Every checkpoint in the jurisdiction would now require at least 2 officers present, with one designated as a supervisor. Body cameras would be mandatory, and footage would be automatically flagged for review if an arrest occurred without a breathalyzer test or field sobriety examination. Officers would undergo quarterly training specifically focused on constitutional rights during traffic stops. Any citizen could request body camera footage of their own stop within 72 hours. And perhaps most importantly, an independent civilian review board would be established with actual authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The board wouldn't just be decorative, it would have subpoena power. Rivers signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday morning. By that afternoon, local news outlets were reporting the story. The headlines varied, but the message was consistent. City pays $600,000 and implements reforms after unlawful arrest of military officer. Grant's name was mentioned in every article. His mugshot, because yes, he ended up with one after his termination triggered a separate investigation, appeared alongside photos of Rivers in uniform. The contrast was stark and intentional. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some people praised the settlement as accountability. Others complained about taxpayer money being used to pay someone who should have just complied. That second group always showed up, insisting that any interaction with police should involve immediate obedience, regardless of legality. They never seemed to grasp that compliance doesn't equal consent, and rights don't disappear just because someone wears a badge. Rivers didn't engage with the online commentary. He released one statement through his attorney, thanking those who supported him and expressing hope that the policy changes would protect others. Then he went back to work. His commanding officer had been supportive throughout the ordeal, making sure Rivers had access to counseling resources and time off when needed. But military culture being what it is, Rivers knew some colleagues viewed the lawsuit as making waves unnecessarily. He heard the whispers, heard people suggest he should have just accepted the apology and moved on. Heard others claim he was chasing a payday. It didn't matter. He had done what needed to be done. Grant, meanwhile, was struggling to find employment. Getting fired from law enforcement leaves a mark that follows you. Other departments wouldn't touch him. Not with that termination reason in his file. Not with his name attached to a $600,000 settlement. Not with video evidence of his incompetence freely available online. He tried security work, but even those companies were hesitant. They didn't want someone whose judgment had been so publicly questioned. He eventually found work doing loss prevention at a retail chain 2 counties over, watching cameras and confronting shoplifters. It was a spectacular fall from someone who had once carried a badge and believed himself untouchable. His family relationships suffered too. His wife had stood by him initially, believing his version of events. Then she watched the body camera footage after it was released as part of public records requests. She saw her husband ignore obvious facts, escalate unnecessarily, and arrest someone for no legitimate reason. The cognitive dissonance was too much. They separated 4 months after his termination. Grant blamed Rivers for destroying his life. He told anyone who would listen that he had been doing his job, that Rivers had been difficult, that the whole situation was blown out of proportion by people with agendas. He never once acknowledged that his own decisions created every problem he faced, that his assumptions and ego turned a routine checkpoint into a career-ending disaster. that he had been given multiple opportunities to de-escalate and chose aggression every time. Mitchell, the partner who had tried to stop the arrest, received a commendation for his professionalism. His body camera footage was now used in training academies as an example of how to handle situations correctly, how to question a partner's judgment respectfully, how to document concerns in real time, how to be a good officer even when working alongside a bad one. The checkpoint where everything happened was eventually moved to a different location. Too many people had started stopping there deliberately, filming officers, asking questions about the Rivers case. It became more trouble than it was worth. The new location was quieter, less controversial, and operated under the new protocols that required supervisor presence and proper testing procedures. 6 months after the settlement, Rivers was promoted. His exemplary service record and the quiet dignity he had shown throughout the legal process impressed his superiors. He never sought publicity, never grandstanded, never turned his experience into a platform for personal gain. He simply did his job and trusted the system to eventually work. The promotion came with a transfer to a different base, which suited him fine. He was ready for a fresh start, somewhere his name wasn't immediately recognized. Somewhere he could just be a soldier again, rather than the guy from that lawsuit. Before leaving, he did one interview with a local journalist who had covered the story fairly. He was asked what he wanted people to remember about what happened. His answer was measured. He said he hoped people understood that rights matter even during routine interactions, that questions aren't threats, that accountability shouldn't require lawsuits and settlements, that good officers exist, but systems need to identify and remove bad ones quickly. The journalist asked if he had any message for Grant. Rivers thought about it for a long moment before responding. He said he hoped the former officer would eventually understand why everything happened the way it did. But he wasn't holding his breath. Some people never learn. Some people always blame others for consequences they brought on themselves. The interview aired 2 days before Rivers left for his new assignment. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. People connected with his measured approach, his refusal to be bitter despite everything he had endured. Comments flooded in from other service members, sharing their own stories of being stopped, questioned, and treated as suspects despite their uniforms and credentials. The common thread was clear. These encounters happened far too often to far too many people who deserved better. 3 weeks after Rivers transferred, something unexpected happened that put the entire case back in the headlines. A former colleague of Grant came forward with recordings. Not official body camera footage, but private recordings from inside patrol vehicles during shifts. Recordings that should never have existed because they violated department policy. The colleague, whose identity was protected, had been collecting evidence for months before the Rivers incident. He had watched Grant operate with impunity for too long and decided someone needed documentation of the pattern. The recordings were damning. They captured Grant making explicitly racist comments about residents in certain neighborhoods, laughing about stops he had made without justification, bragging about intimidating people who questioned him, discussing strategies for provoking reactions that would justify arrests. The audio was crystal clear, undeniable, and it painted a picture of someone who had been abusing his authority, systematically, for years. Legal experts immediately recognized the implications. If this pattern could be established, every single arrest Grant had made during his career was now potentially questionable. Defense attorneys began filing motions to re-examine cases. People who had pleaded guilty to charges stemming from Grant's arrests started requesting new hearings. The district attorney's office faced a nightmare scenario where dozens, potentially hundreds of cases might need to be reviewed or overturned. The police department tried to contain the damage, but the recordings spread too quickly. News organizations obtained copies. Civil rights groups held press conferences. Former defendants who had always maintained their innocence suddenly had evidence supporting their claims. One man who had spent 8 months in jail on charges that were eventually dropped came forward with his story. Grant had stopped him for a broken taillight, then claimed to smell marijuana, then arrested him for resisting when he asked questions. The man lost his job during the legal process, fell behind on rent, and ended up homeless for a period. all because of a stop that never should have happened. Another woman described being pulled over 6 times in 2 years, always by the same officer, Grant. Each time he found a reason. Expired registration that wasn't actually expired. Failure to signal that she had signaled. Suspicious behavior that was just her driving to work. She eventually sold her car and started taking buses because the anxiety of potentially being stopped again was too much. She had never been charged with anything, never received a ticket that stuck, but the harassment had been relentless and deliberate. The recordings revealed that Grant had specifically targeted certain areas of the city, areas with higher minority populations. He had bragged to colleagues about how easy it was to find reasons to stop people, how most wouldn't fight back because they were afraid or didn't know their rights. He had described it as fishing in a stocked pond. The casual cruelty in his voice while saying these things made even hardened investigators uncomfortable. Federal authorities got involved. What started as a local department issue escalated to a civil rights investigation. The FBI opened a case examining whether Grant's actions constituted a pattern of rights violations that warranted federal prosecution. The Department of Justice sent investigators to interview witnesses and review records. This was no longer just about one wrongful arrest. This was about systematic abuse of power over years. Grant's attorney released a statement claiming the recordings were taken out of context, that police officers often use dark humor to cope with stress, that nothing on the recordings proved actual misconduct. The statement convinced exactly nobody. Context doesn't change explicitly racist language. Stress relief doesn't justify bragging about violating rights. The excuses were transparent and desperate. Meanwhile, the financial costs kept mounting for the city. Rivers' settlement had been just the beginning. 3 more lawsuits were filed within a month of the recordings becoming public. Each one cited Grant's documented pattern of behavior as evidence that the department had failed to supervise and discipline a problem officer. Each one sought damages not just from Grant, but from the city itself for negligent retention. The city's insurance carrier sent a letter warning that continued payouts related to one officer's misconduct might affect future coverage rates. The police chief, who had survived the initial scandal, now found his position untenable. City council members who had defended him before were now calling for his resignation. How could he not have known about Grant's pattern? Why hadn't Internal Affairs caught this earlier? What did it say about department culture that Grant felt comfortable expressing these views to colleagues? The chief announced his retirement effective immediately, citing health reasons. Nobody believed the excuse, but everyone accepted the departure. His replacement was brought in from outside the department specifically to reform the culture. She was a respected commander from another city, with a track record of implementing accountability measures and community policing initiatives. Her first act was ordering a comprehensive review of every stop, arrest, and use of force incident from the past 5 years. Her second act was meeting with community leaders who had been complaining about policing practices for years and had been largely ignored. The review took 4 months, and the findings were worse than anticipated. Grant wasn't the only problem, just the most egregious example. The data showed clear disparities in who got stopped, who got arrested, who got charged. Officers in certain units had stop rates for minority drivers that were statistically impossible to explain through legitimate law enforcement activity. The report didn't use the word racism directly, but the evidence spoke clearly enough. Reforms came swiftly after that. Mandatory bias training that actually had teeth, not just checkbox compliance. New supervision protocols requiring sergeants to review body camera footage regularly. A civilian review board with actual authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. An early warning system to flag officers with complaint patterns before they became Grant-level disasters. None of it would undo the harm already done, but it might prevent future harm. Grant himself faced additional consequences as the federal investigation progressed. Prosecutors decided there was enough evidence to charge him with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime carrying potential prison time. The indictment cited multiple incidents beyond the Rivers case, using the recordings and witness testimony to establish a pattern. Grant pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive defense attorney using money from a legal defense fund set up by supporters who believed he was being persecuted. The trial date was set for 8 months out. Legal observers predicted a conviction was likely given the evidence, but Grant seemed determined to fight rather than accept a plea deal. His lawyer's strategy appeared to be attacking the credibility of witnesses and arguing that aggressive policing shouldn't be criminalized. It was a risky approach that might backfire spectacularly when jurors heard Grant's own words on those recordings. Rivers heard about the federal charges while settling into his new assignment. Colleagues asked if he felt vindicated. He said vindication wasn't really the right word. Justice, maybe, but even that felt incomplete because justice after the fact doesn't undo the original injustice. He had been handcuffed on a public road for no legitimate reason. That happened, and nothing could unhappen it. What Rivers did feel was hope, that the system might actually change in ways that mattered. Not because of his case alone, but because enough pressure had finally built up that ignoring the problems was no longer possible. The recordings had done what individual complaints never could. They had made the pattern undeniable, even to people who wanted to deny it. The checkpoint protocols Rivers had helped design were now being adopted by other bases. His suggestions about supervisor presence and proper testing procedures were becoming standard practice. Officers were being retrained on how to conduct stops respectfully while still maintaining security. It wasn't revolutionary, just basic professionalism that should have been standard all along. 10 months after that roadside encounter, Rivers received a letter from the Department of Justice. They were including his case as part of the federal prosecution and wanted to know if he would be willing to testify about his experience. He agreed immediately, not for revenge or satisfaction, but because his testimony might help establish the pattern that would prevent this from happening to others. Grant's world had completely collapsed under the weight of his own actions. The badge he had hidden behind was gone. The authority he had abused was stripped away. The career he had destroyed through his own choices was over. He faced federal prison time, financial ruin, and a legacy as an example of everything wrong with unchecked power. None of it had to happen. At any point, he could have chosen differently. He could have treated Rivers with basic respect. He could have followed proper procedures. He could have listened when his partner raised concerns. Every single decision that led to his downfall was his own. The interview aired 2 days before Rivers left for his new assignment. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. People connected with his measured approach, his refusal to be bitter despite everything he had endured. Comments flooded in from other service members sharing their own stories of being stopped, questioned, and treated as suspects despite their uniforms and credentials. The common thread was clear. These encounters happened far too often to far too many people who deserved better. 3 weeks after Rivers transferred, something unexpected happened that put the entire case back in the headlines. A former colleague of Grant came forward with recordings. Not official body camera footage, but private recordings from inside patrol vehicles during shifts. Recordings that should never have existed because they violated department policy. The colleague, whose identity was protected, had been collecting evidence for months before the Rivers incident. He had watched Grant operate with impunity for too long, and decided someone needed documentation of the pattern. The recordings were damning. They captured Grant making explicitly racist comments about residents in certain neighborhoods, laughing about stops he had made without justification, bragging about intimidating people who questioned him, discussing strategies for provoking reactions that would justify arrests. The audio was crystal clear, undeniable, and it painted a picture of someone who had been abusing his authority systematically for years. Legal experts immediately recognized the implications. If this pattern could be established, every single arrest Grant had made during his career was now potentially questionable. Defense attorneys began filing motions to re-examine cases. People who had pleaded guilty to charges stemming from Grant's arrests started requesting new hearings. The district attorney's office faced a nightmare scenario where dozens, potentially hundreds of cases might need to be reviewed or overturned. The police department tried to contain the damage, but the recordings spread too quickly. News organizations obtained copies. Civil rights groups held press conferences. Former defendants, who had always maintained their innocence, suddenly had evidence supporting their claims. One man who had spent 8 months in jail on charges that were eventually dropped came forward with his story. Grant had stopped him for a broken taillight, then claimed to smell marijuana, then arrested him for resisting when he asked questions. The man lost his job during the legal process, fell behind on rent, and ended up homeless for a period. All because of a stop that never should have happened. Another woman described being pulled over 6 times in 2 years, always by the same officer, Grant. Each time he found a reason. Expired registration that wasn't actually expired. Failure to signal that she had signaled. Suspicious behavior that was just her driving to work. She eventually sold her car and started taking buses because the anxiety of potentially being stopped again was too much. She had never been charged with anything, never received a ticket that stuck, but the harassment had been relentless and deliberate. The recordings revealed that Grant had specifically targeted certain areas of the city, areas with higher minority populations. He had bragged to colleagues about how easy it was to find reasons to stop people, how most wouldn't fight back because they were afraid or didn't know their rights. He had described it as fishing in a stocked pond. The casual cruelty in his voice while saying these things made even hardened investigators uncomfortable. Federal authorities got involved. What started as a local department issue escalated to a civil rights investigation. The FBI opened a case examining whether Grant's actions constituted a pattern of rights violations that warranted federal prosecution. The Department of Justice sent investigators to interview witnesses and review records. This was no longer just about one wrongful arrest. This was about systematic abuse of power over years. Grant's attorney released a statement claiming the recordings were taken out of context, that police officers often use dark humor to cope with stress, that nothing on the recordings proved actual misconduct. The statement convinced exactly nobody. Context doesn't change explicitly racist language. Stress relief doesn't justify bragging about violating rights. The excuses were transparent and desperate. Meanwhile, the financial costs kept mounting for the city. River's settlement had been just the beginning. 3 more lawsuits were filed within a month of the recordings becoming public. Each one cited Grant's documented pattern of behavior as evidence that the department had failed to supervise and discipline a problem officer. Each one sought damages not just from Grant, but from the city itself for negligent retention. The city's insurance carrier sent a letter warning that continued payouts related to one officer's misconduct might affect future coverage rates. The police chief, who had survived the initial scandal, now found his position untenable. City council members who had defended him before were now calling for his resignation. How could he not have known about Grant's pattern? Why hadn't Internal Affairs caught this earlier? What did it say about department culture that Grant felt comfortable expressing these views to colleagues? The chief announced his retirement effective immediately, citing health reasons. Nobody believed the excuse, but everyone accepted the departure. His replacement was brought in from outside the department specifically to reform the culture. She was a respected commander from another city with a track record of implementing accountability measures and community policing initiatives. Her first act was ordering a comprehensive review of every stop, arrest, and use of force incident from the past 5 years. Her second act was meeting with community leaders who had been complaining about policing practices for years and had been largely ignored. The review took 4 months, and the findings were worse than anticipated. Grant wasn't the only problem, just the most egregious example. The data showed clear disparities in who got stopped, who got arrested, who got charged. Officers in certain units had stop rates for minority drivers that were statistically impossible to explain through legitimate law enforcement activity. The report didn't use the word racism directly, but the evidence spoke clearly enough. Reforms came swiftly after that. Mandatory bias training that actually had teeth, not just checkbox compliance. New supervision protocols requiring sergeants to review body camera footage regularly. A civilian review board with actual authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. An early warning system to flag officers with complaint patterns before they became Grant-level disasters. None of it would undo the harm already done, but it might prevent future harm. Grant himself faced additional consequences as the federal investigation progressed. Prosecutors decided there was enough evidence to charge him with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime carrying potential prison time. The indictment cited multiple incidents beyond the Rivers case, using the recordings and witness testimony to establish a pattern. Grant pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive defense attorney, using money from a legal defense fund set up by supporters who believed he was being persecuted. The trial date was set for 8 months out. Legal observers predicted a conviction was likely given the evidence, but Grant seemed determined to fight rather than accept a plea deal. His lawyer's strategy appeared to be attacking the credibility of witnesses and arguing that aggressive policing shouldn't be criminalized. It was a risky approach that might backfire spectacularly when jurors heard Grant's own words on those recordings. Rivers heard about the federal charges while settling into his new assignment. Colleagues asked if he felt vindicated. He said vindication wasn't really the right word. Justice, maybe, but even that felt incomplete, because justice after the fact doesn't undo the original injustice. He had been handcuffed on a public road for no legitimate reason. That happened, and nothing could unhappen it. What Rivers did feel was hope that the system might actually change in ways that mattered. Not because of his case alone, but because enough pressure had finally built up that ignoring the problems was no longer possible. The recordings had done what individual complaints never could. They had made the pattern undeniable even to people who wanted to deny it. The checkpoint protocols Rivers had helped design were now being adopted by other bases. His suggestions about supervisor presence and proper testing procedures were becoming standard practice. Officers were being retrained on how to conduct stops respectfully while still maintaining security. It wasn't revolutionary, just basic professionalism that should have been standard all along. 10 months after that roadside encounter, Rivers received a letter from the Department of Justice. They were including his case as part of the federal prosecution and wanted to know if he would be willing to testify about his experience. He agreed immediately. Not for revenge or satisfaction, but because his testimony might help establish the pattern that would prevent this from happening to others. Grant's trial began on a cold morning in February. The courtroom was packed with journalists, community activists, and former defendants who had their own stories about encounters with the disgraced officer. Rivers sat in the witness section, wearing his dress uniform at the request of prosecutors, who wanted the jury to see exactly who Grant had targeted that night. When Rivers took the stand, he recounted the checkpoint stop in the same measured tone he had used throughout this entire ordeal. No embellishment needed. The facts were damning enough on their own. The defense attorney tried to rattle him during cross-examination, suggesting Rivers had been confrontational, that he had escalated the situation by refusing lawful orders. Rivers calmly explained that asking for probable cause isn't confrontational, that requesting a supervisor isn't escalation, that asserting constitutional rights isn't resistance. The attorney pushed harder, implying Rivers had used his military status to intimidate Grant. Rivers looked directly at the jury and said he had simply identified himself truthfully, same as he would have done for any official interaction. The jury's expression suggested they weren't buying the defense narrative. The prosecution played the body camera footage for the jury. All 8 minutes of it. The courtroom went silent as they watched Grant ignore obvious signs of sobriety, dismiss his partner's concerns, and arrest a decorated military officer for the crime of asking questions. When the footage ended, several jurors were visibly angry. The defense had no effective counter to video evidence. Then came the recordings. Hours of Grant's own words revealing his true attitudes and methods. The jury heard him laugh about stops he knew were questionable. They heard him use racial slurs casually. They heard him discuss targeting specific neighborhoods because people there were less likely to fight back. By the third day of testimony, Grant's fate was sealed. His own voice had convicted him more effectively than any witness could. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Grant showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his attorney slumped in his chair, knowing the appeals would be uphill battles with minimal chance of success. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, a former prosecutor who had seen plenty of bad cops in her career, didn't mince words. She said Grant had betrayed the public trust, violated the oath he took, and damaged countless lives through his systematic abuse of authority. She sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison, far longer than his attorney had hoped for. Rivers didn't attend the sentencing. He had testified, done his part, and moved on. By that point, he was thriving in his new assignment, leading training exercises and mentoring younger SEALs. The case had become something that happened to him rather than something that defined him. He checked the news occasionally, saw that Grant had been sentenced, felt a brief moment of satisfaction, then went back to his life. The broader changes continued long after Grant went to prison. The Civilian Review Board proved effective, investigating complaints thoroughly and recommending discipline when warranted. Several officers were fired or suspended based on the board's findings. Others resigned rather than face scrutiny. The department's culture shifted slowly but noticeably. Officers who had operated with impunity suddenly faced actual accountability. Community trust began rebuilding, though it would take years to fully repair the damage. Other jurisdictions started paying attention. The case became a teaching example in police academies and law schools. What not to do. How unchecked bias destroys careers and communities. Why accountability mechanisms matter. Grant's name became synonymous with the kind of policing that progressive departments were trying to leave behind. 2 years after the checkpoint stop, Rivers was promoted again. His personnel file noted his exemplary service, his leadership qualities, and his composure under difficult circumstances. No mention of the lawsuit or the case that had briefly made him a public figure. Just a straightforward recognition of a good officer doing good work. Exactly how he preferred it. Grant served 3 years before being released on supervised parole. He moved to a different state, took a job doing manual labor, and largely disappeared from public view. Occasionally, someone would recognize him from the news coverage, and he would have to explain or make excuses, or just leave quickly to avoid confrontation. His life had become small and constrained, limited by choices he made during 8 minutes at a checkpoint. The woman who had been harassed during 6 traffic stops got her driver's license reinstated after years of anxiety had kept her from driving. She bought a used car and drove past the old checkpoint location deliberately, reclaiming a piece of autonomy that Grant had stolen. The man who had been jailed on false charges received compensation from a fund established for Grant's victims. It didn't give him back the 8 months he lost, but it helped him get back on his feet. Vincent, the supervisor who had diffused the situation that night, eventually became a captain. He used his position to implement training focused on de-escalation and constitutional policing. Mitchell, the partner who had tried to stop Grant, became a training officer herself, teaching new recruits about the importance of speaking up when they see misconduct. Both of them carried the checkpoint incident as a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when officers let bias override judgment. The checkpoint itself was eventually discontinued entirely. The new police chief decided that the community relations damage outweighed any public safety benefit. DUI enforcement shifted to roving patrols and targeted operations based on actual data rather than arbitrary stops. Arrests for drunk driving didn't decrease. They just happened through smarter policing instead of constitutional violations. 5 years after that night, Rivers was still serving, still leading, still making a difference in ways both big and small. He had never given another interview about the case. He had moved on completely, though he occasionally thought about that 8-minute encounter when he saw checkpoint signs or heard about similar incidents. The memory had lost its sharp edges, becoming just another experience in a life full of challenges overcome. Grant's former colleagues rarely spoke about him. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered in locker rooms and patrol cars. Don't be like Grant. Don't let your biases control you. Don't assume you're untouchable. The body cameras don't lie. Your actions have consequences. Simple lessons that should never have needed such a dramatic example. But sometimes, people only learn through spectacular failures. The $600,000 settlement had been spent on programs that helped other victims of police misconduct. Rivers had insisted on that condition. The money did more good helping others than it would have sitting in his bank account. Legal aid organizations, civil rights groups, and community initiatives all benefited from funds that came from his willingness to fight back against injustice. That 8-minute traffic stop changed dozens of lives. It ended one career and elevated another. It sparked reforms and investigations. It exposed patterns and forced reckonings. All because one officer made assumptions based on skin color rather than evidence. And one sailor refused to accept being treated as guilty until proven innocent. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there. Can't shut your mind off, and the next day, you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.